The winter of 1867 descended upon northern New Mexico like a biblical curse, burying the mountains beneath 15 feet of snow and silencing the world under a blanket of white death. Sarah Brennan stood at the frosted window of her cabin, watching the blizzard rage against the glass with the fury of a wounded animal. 6 months. 6 months since they'd buried Thomas beneath the frozen earth. 6 months since pneumonia had stolen him away, leaving her alone in this wilderness that showed no mercy to the weak. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her forehead against the cold pane. The cabin felt enormous in its emptiness. Every corner echoed with memories of the husband who'd promised her freedom in the West, only to leave her with solitude instead. Boston felt like another lifetime now, a distant dream of cobblestone streets and suffocating parlors, where her uncle had tried to sell her off to the highest bidder like a prize mare. She'd run toward love, toward Thomas, and his gentle promises of a new life. But love, she'd learned, could die as easily as men. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah," Thomas had whispered on his deathbed, his calloused hand squeezing hers one final time. "Promise me you'll survive this. Promise me you won't let them break you," she'd promised. And she'd kept that promise through 6 months of learning to split wood with blistered hands, to hunt rabbits with Thomas's old rifle, to wake every morning and choose survival over surrender. But this winter, this merciless, killing winter, tested that promise with every frozen breath. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters. Sarah turned from the window, wrapping her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire in the stone hearth crackled weakly, consuming the last of yesterday's wood. She'd need to bring in more before nightfall, though the thought of stepping into that white hell made her bones ache with dread. She was pulling on Thomas's oversized coat, still carrying the ghost of his scent when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind, a low animal groan that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to the rifle mounted above the door. Another groan, closer now. Something alive. Something suffering. Every rational thought screamed at her to bolt the door, to hide, to survive. But her hands, healer's hands, trained by necessity and desperation, reached for the rifle anyway. She'd nursed Thomas through his final days, had birthed calves and set broken wings. The instinct to heal ran deeper than the instinct to hide. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. Snow swirled around her in vicious eddies, stinging her face, stealing her breath. She squinted against the white wall, following the sound toward the tree line where the forest pressed close to her small clearing. That's when she saw him. A man lay crumpled in the snow 20 yards from her door, dark hair spread like a raven's wing against the white. Even from here, she could see the unnatural stillness of his body, the blue tinge creeping across his exposed skin. He wore leather clothing. Buckskin, she realized with a jolt of fear, decorated with intricate beadwork, now crusted with ice. Apache. The word froze in her throat colder than the winter air. Every settler's warning echoed in her skull. Never trust an Apache. They'll kill you as soon as look at you. They're savages, monsters, demons in human skin. But as she stood there, rifle heavy in her trembling hands, all she could see was a dying man, a human being freezing to death in her snow. "Mercy," she whispered to the howling wind, though she wasn't sure if it was a prayer or a curse. She moved before her mind could stop her, wading through hip-deep snow toward the fallen figure. Up close, she could see the severity of his condition. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow and irregular. A nasty gash across his temple had bled and frozen, painting the side of his face with dried crimson. His eyes were closed, his strong features slack with unconsciousness. He was magnificent and terrible all at once, tall, powerfully built despite the starvation of winter, with a warrior's scars mapping his exposed arms. This was no ordinary man. Everything about him spoke of strength, of danger, of a life lived on the razor's edge between survival and death. "Turn back," reason whispered. "Leave him, save yourself." But Sarah's hands were already reaching down, already checking for a pulse. There, faint but present, a stubborn rhythm refusing to surrender. She thought of Thomas, of his final words, of the promise she'd made to stay strong. Strength, she'd learned, came in many forms. Sometimes it meant knowing when to fight, sometimes it meant knowing when to save. "Goodness gracious," she muttered, shoving her shoulder under his arm. "You're going to get us both killed." He was impossibly heavy, dead weight that nearly pulled her down into the snow. But Sarah had spent 6 months hauling water and firewood, had developed a wiry strength that defied her slender frame. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him toward her cabin, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning with the effort. By the time she hauled him through her doorway, she was sobbing with exhaustion. He collapsed on her floor in a puddle of melting snow, still as death. Sarah slammed the door against the storm and leaned against it, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. What have I done? But there was no time for doubt. She could second-guess her sanity later. Right now, a man was dying on her floor. She worked with the efficiency of desperation, stripping away his frozen buckskin clothing with fingers that barely obeyed her commands. His skin was like ice beneath her touch, his core temperature dangerously low. She'd seen hypothermia before, had lost neighbors to it, had nearly succumbed to it herself during particularly brutal nights. Sarah dragged every blanket she owned from her bed, wrapping him in layers of wool and cotton. She built up the fire until it roared like a living thing, filling the cabin with precious warmth. Then, knowing what had to be done but hating it nonetheless, she stripped off her own damp clothes and climbed beneath the blankets with him. The cold of his skin shocked through her, making her gasp. But she pressed close anyway, sharing her body's warmth, willing her heat into his frozen flesh. This was medicine, she told herself, just medicine. The fact that she could feel every plane and angle of his powerful body meant nothing. The fact that even unconscious and dying, he radiated a kind of wild strength that made her breath catch, that meant nothing at all. "Don't you dare die," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice fierce. "I didn't drag your impossible weight through a blizzard just to watch you give up. You hear me? Don't you dare." His only answer was the shallow rasp of his breathing. Sarah held him through that first night, feeding the fire, changing his position to prevent pressure sores, dripping water between his cracked lips. His fever spiked violently around midnight, making him thrash and mutter in a language she didn't understand. She pressed cool cloths to his burning forehead, held him steady when his nightmares made him fight invisible enemies. In the flickering firelight, she studied his face properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, perhaps less. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken and healed crooked. His hair, dried now, fell past his shoulders in a thick, straight curtain of black silk. Even weakened by fever and injury, his face held a kind of fierce beauty that made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. "Who are you?" she wondered, tracing the edge of a scar that ran along his collarbone. "What brought you to my door?" The storm raged outside for 3 days and 3 nights. Sarah barely left his side, existing in a strange liminal space between waking and sleeping, between past and present. She talked to him sometimes, filling the silence with stories about Boston, about Thomas, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. "I ran away from a marriage," she confessed on the second night, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "My uncle wanted me to marry a banker, old, cruel, with hands like dead fish. I was supposed to be grateful for the match, supposed to smile and curtsy and surrender my entire life to a man who looked at me like I was property to be acquired." She laughed bitterly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. "So I ran, stole money from my uncle's safe, bought passage on a train heading west and never looked back. Thomas found me in Santa Fe, thought I was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. He promised me freedom, promised me choice. And he kept that promise until the day he died." The man stirred, murmuring something in his fever. Sarah pressed her hand to his forehead, still too hot but cooler than before. The fever was breaking. "I chose to save you," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I have no idea if that makes me brave or stupid. Probably both. Thomas would have told me I was crazy. Every settler for 100 miles would call me a traitor. But here's the thing. I didn't come to the West to let fear rule my choices. I came here to be free, and that means living by my own code, making my own decisions, even the reckless ones." She leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at her bones. "So you better wake up," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "Because if you die after all this effort, I'm going to be extremely annoyed." She didn't see his eyes flutter open in the darkness, didn't see the way his gaze found her face, studying her with an intensity that would have stolen her breath, didn't see the ghost of recognition that flickered across his features before unconsciousness claimed him again. But if she had, she would have seen something that would have changed everything. The look of a man who'd just found something he hadn't known he was searching for. On the fourth morning, Sarah woke to find him watching her. His eyes were open, dark, fathomless, holding the depth of mountain lakes beneath winter ice. They tracked her smallest movement as she sat up, as she pushed her tangled hair from her face, as she reached instinctively for the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder. "You're awake," she breathed, relief flooding through her. Then, more cautiously, "Do you understand English?" For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're in my home," Sarah continued, keeping her voice soft and steady despite the racing of her heart. "You were freezing to death outside. I brought you in. You've been unconscious for 3 days." Something flickered in those dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or calculation. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in every detail with the swift assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. When his eyes returned to her, there was a new weight to his stare, an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Water," she offered, reaching for the tin cup beside the bed. He accepted it with a slight inclination of his head, drinking deeply. She watched his throat work as he swallowed, watched the way the firelight played across the angles of his face. He handed the cup back with another small nod, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and command, as if he were accustomed to giving thanks, but unaccustomed to needing to. "I am Kuruk," he said finally, his voice low and rough from disuse. His English was accented but clear, each word chosen with careful precision. "War chief of the Jicarilla people. These mountains, these valleys, they answer to me." Sarah's breath caught. She'd heard that name before, whispered in terrified tones at the trading post, muttered like a curse by soldiers passing through. Kuruk, the Apache leader who moved through the territory like smoke, who could strike without warning and vanish without trace. They said he was ruthless, merciless, a force of nature as unforgiving as the desert sun. They said his word was law among his people. They said he bowed to no one, and she'd dragged him into her cabin like a lost puppy. "Oh," she managed weakly. "Well, that's unfortunate." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. "You knew what I was when you found me." It wasn't a question. Sarah lifted her chin anyway, meeting his gaze with all the false courage she could muster. "I knew you were dying, that's all that mattered." "Why?" The single word held worlds of genuine curiosity. Sarah found herself answering honestly, too exhausted for anything else. "Because I couldn't walk away. Because I've spent 6 months alone in these mountains, and I'm tired of death. Because sometimes the only way to stay human is to act like one, even when it's foolish." Kuruk studied her in silence, his dark eyes seeming to peer straight through her skin into the hidden chambers of her heart. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Among my people, a life debt is sacred. You pulled me from death's grip. By the laws of the Jicarilla, I owe you protection. My strength is your shield. My life guards yours." Sarah's heart stuttered. That's not necessary. I didn't save you for payment. It is done." His tone brooked no argument. "You are under my protection now. You belong to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Sarah wasn't ready to examine. She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to explain that she hadn't fled one form of ownership just to accept another, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't the look of a man claiming property. It was the look of a man accepting responsibility, shouldering a burden he would carry until death. There was honor in that gaze and something else, something that made her skin flush with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm not anyone's property," she said quietly but firmly. "Not yours, not any man's. I came to these mountains to be free." For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered across Kuruk's face. "Then you will be free," he said simply, "under my protection." It wasn't exactly the answer she wanted, but as his eyes held hers in the firelight, as the storm continued to rage outside and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a secret, Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, She'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than any blizzard. She'd saved the life of a man who never forgot a debt. A man whose very presence seemed to fill her small cabin with a wild, untamed energy that made her heart race and her breath catch. A man who looked at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, something worth claiming. The winter had locked them together in this small space, trapped them in a strange intimacy that defied the war raging between their two worlds. And as Kuruk's eyes finally drifted closed again, his body demanding the rest it needed to heal, Sarah sat watching him and wondering what would happen when the snow finally melted. Wondering if, when spring came and the world opened up again, she would want him to leave at all. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song. Inside, by the fire's warmth, something new was beginning to grow, fragile and dangerous and entirely impossible. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of everything. The days that followed existed in a strange suspension of time, where the outside world ceased to exist beyond the frost-covered windows, and the only reality was the small cabin and its two unlikely inhabitants. The blizzard showed no signs of relenting, sealing them together in isolation that felt both suffocating and strangely intimate. Kuruk healed quickly, far more quickly than Sarah had expected. By the second day of consciousness, he was sitting up. By the third, he was moving around the cabin with the fluid grace of a predator, though she noticed how he favored his left side where bruising darkened his ribs. He'd been in a fight before the cold found him, though he offered no explanation and she didn't ask. They existed in a careful dance of proximity and distance, navigating the strange territory of forced companionship between two people who should have been enemies. Sarah cooked simple meals over the fire: cornmeal mush, beans, the last precious strips of dried venison. Kuruk accepted the food with those small nods of his, eating with an efficiency that spoke of many meals taken quickly, always ready for flight or fight. He watched her constantly, not with aggression but with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of every movement, every gesture. She'd catch him staring as she mended clothes by the firelight, as she brushed out her copper hair, as she moved about the tiny space performing the mundane tasks of survival. His gaze felt like a physical touch, warm and weighted, and it made her skin tingle with an awareness she tried desperately to ignore. On the fifth day, she woke to find him at her small workbench, examining Thomas's tools with careful attention. He held up a broken axe handle, one eyebrow raised in question. "It snapped last week," Sarah explained, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I've been making do with the hatchet, but it's barely adequate for splitting kindling." Without a word, Kuruk moved to the small pile of spare wood Thomas had stored in the corner. He selected a piece with the assurance of someone who'd crafted 1,000 tools, running his long fingers along the grain, testing its strength. Then he drew a knife from somewhere, she hadn't even known he still had a weapon, and began to carve. Sarah watched, mesmerized, as the wood took shape beneath his skilled hands. He worked with complete focus, each movement precise and purposeful, shavings falling like snow around his feet. There was something almost meditative about the way he carved, a kind of centered calm that seemed at odds with his reputation as a feared warrior. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. His eyes lifted to hers, dark and unreadable. "You saved my life. I will not sit idle while you struggle. I'm managing just fine." The corner of his mouth quirked, that not-quite smile she was beginning to recognize. "Your kindling pile says otherwise." Despite herself, Sarah felt her lips twitch with amusement. "Are you criticizing my woodcutting skills?" "I am observing facts." He returned his attention to the wood, but she could see the glimmer of something that might have been humor in his eyes. "You are stubborn and proud. These are good qualities, but they do not split wood effectively." "I'm not stubborn," Sarah protested, then caught herself. "Well, perhaps a little." "A little," Kuruk agreed, his tone grave, but his eyes betraying that hint of warmth again. "Like the mountains are a little tall." She laughed, actually laughed, the sound startling them both in the quiet cabin. When was the last time she'd laughed? Months, maybe. Since before Thomas's death, certainly. The sound felt rusty and strange, but good. So good. Kuruk's hands stilled on the wood. He was staring at her again, but this time his expression was different. Softer, almost wondering. "What?" Sarah asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have courage," he said quietly, "but you carry great sadness. I see it in your eyes even when you smile." The observation struck too close to the bone. Sarah turned away, busying herself with stoking the fire. "My husband died 6 months ago. Pneumonia took him quickly. It hasn't been easy." Silence stretched between them. Then, "You loved him." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes, he was kind, gentle. He saw me as more than just a woman to be managed or controlled. When I ran from Boston, he was the first person who asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I should want. And what did you want?" Sarah paused, the poker frozen in her hand as she stared into the flames. "Freedom," she said finally. "Choice. The ability to make my own decisions, to live by my own rules." Thomas understood that. He never tried to cage me. She heard Kuruk move behind her, heard the whisper of his bare feet on the wooden floor. When she turned, he was standing close, not threatening, but near enough that she could see the complex emotions moving through his dark eyes. "Among my people," he said slowly, "women are not property. They choose their husbands. They own their homes. They speak in council and their words carry weight." He paused, his gaze intense. "Your freedom is not something I would take from you, Sarah Brennan. It is something I would defend with my life." Her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. This was the first time he'd used her name, had acknowledged her as more than just the woman who saved me. Somehow, hearing him say it in that low, rough voice made it feel like a caress. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does it matter to you?" Kuruk was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "Because you are like the hawk," he said finally. "Beautiful and fierce. To cage such a creature would be to destroy what makes it magnificent." The words hung between them, laden with meaning Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to unpack. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could feel the heat rising to her cheeks, despite the winter cold that pressed against the cabin walls. I should check the wood supply," she stammered, stepping back, needing distance from the intensity of his presence. Kuruk let her go, but she felt his eyes on her as she bundled into Thomas's coat and ventured out into the snow. The cold air hit her like a slap, clearing her head, giving her space to breathe. What is happening to me? She'd loved Thomas, still loved him in a way. Her grief was real and present, but this thing growing between her and the Apache warrior felt different, dangerous. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the void below, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. When she returned with an armload of wood, Kuruk had finished the axe handle. It was beautiful, smooth and perfectly balanced, the grain of the wood brought out by his careful work. He'd even carved a small pattern into the grip, geometric designs that reminded her of the beadwork on his buckskin clothes. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It will serve you well," Kuruk said simply. Then, with that characteristic directness of his, "But you should not be living here alone when winter comes again. This place is too isolated, too dangerous for one person." Sarah stiffened. "I've managed this long." "You have survived," he corrected. "That is not the same as living." The words stung because they were true. She'd been existing, not living. Going through the motions of survival without ever truly being present, wrapped in her grief like a shroud. "What would you have me do?" she asked, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. "Abandon the home Thomas and I built? Run back to civilization and beg for scraps?" "No." Kuruk's response was firm. "You should never beg." He moved closer, and Sarah found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from his intense gaze. "But you should not be alone. It is not natural, not right." "And what would you suggest?" The question came out sharper than she intended, colored by fear and confusion, and the treacherous warmth spreading through her chest. Kuruk reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. When she didn't move, he touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. His skin was warm now, no longer the ice-cold flesh she'd wrapped herself around days ago. The touch sent electricity racing down her spine. "I would suggest," he said quietly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone, "that when the snow melts and I return to my people, you come with me." Sarah's eyes widened. "What? You would be safe there, protected. My people would honor the woman who saved their chief's life. You would have freedom, more than any white settlement would offer you. You would have a place, a purpose. I can't just... I'm not Apache. I don't speak the language, don't know the customs. You would learn. His hand fell away, but his eyes never left hers. And in return, I would ensure that you never face another winter alone, that you never again know the loneliness I see haunting you. It was too much, too fast. Sarah backed away, shaking her head. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. I know you risked everything to save a stranger, Kuruk countered. I know you are stronger than you believe yourself to be. I know you laugh like summer rain and fight like winter wind. I know that in 3 days you have made me feel more alive than I have felt in years of warfare and blood. His words struck her speechless. She stared at him, at this impossible man who'd crashed into her life on wings of snow and storm, and felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd sealed shut when they'd lowered Thomas into the frozen ground. I can't, she whispered, though even as she said it, she felt the lie of it. Kuruk nodded slowly, accepting her words, even though they both knew the truth trembling beneath them. Then I will stay until the snow melts, he said, and when I leave, you will make your choice with clear eyes and full knowledge. The days that followed shifted into something new, something neither of them could quite name, but both felt growing between them like spring shoots pushing through late snow. Kuruk taught her things, how to read weather in the behavior of birds, how to find water beneath snow, how to move silently through the forest. In return, Sarah taught him English words he didn't know, showed him how to make bread from her precious stores of flour, read to him from the small collection of books she'd brought from Boston. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership born of necessity, but deepening into something more. He chopped wood while she mended clothes. She cooked while he kept the fire fed. They sat together in the evenings, speaking little but existing in a companionable silence that felt more intimate than any words. One night, as a fresh storm rattled the shutters, Sarah woke to find Kuruk sitting by the window, his silhouette dark against the frost-covered glass. She rose quietly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and moved to sit beside him. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "I was dreaming," he said, his voice low, "of blood and fire, of battles that never seemed to end." Sarah understood nightmares. She'd had enough of her own. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had carved her an axe handle, that had touched her face with impossible gentleness. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. "Tell me," she said. And he did. In halting words, he spoke of the wars that had defined his life, of watching his village burn when he was a child, of rising through the ranks of his people's warriors, through skill and ruthlessness, of becoming chief at 25 when the previous leader fell in battle. He spoke of the impossible burden of protecting his people against encroaching settlers, of making choices that tore at his soul, of the loneliness of leadership. "I have fought for so long," he said quietly, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand, "that I had forgotten what peace felt like. And then I woke in your cabin, and you were there, with your fire hair and fierce eyes, and for the first time in years I felt still." Sarah's throat tightened. "I know that feeling. Since Thomas died, I've been moving constantly, always working, always busy. Because if I stopped, if I let myself be still, the grief would swallow me whole. And now," she looked up at him, at the face that had become so familiar in such a short time, and felt the truth of her answer in her bones. "Now I think, maybe stillness isn't something to be afraid of. Maybe it's something to be claimed." Kuruk's free hand rose to cup her face, his touch reverent. "Sarah," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I did not come to your mountains seeking anything but death's embrace, but you pulled me back. You showed me that there is more to life than war and blood and endless fighting." "Kuruk!" "No." His forehead came to rest against hers, and Sarah felt her eyes flutter closed, felt herself leaning into his warmth. "Let me speak. Among my people, when a woman saves a warrior's life, it creates a bond that cannot be broken. But this, what I feel when I look at you, this is more than duty, more than honor. This is terrifying." Sarah whispered. "Yes." His laugh was soft, his breath warm against her lips. Terrifying and wonderful and impossible. We barely know each other. I know your strength, your courage, your kindness. What else matters? Sarah's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. Everything else, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The war between our peoples, the fact that I'm still grieving my husband, the impossibility of any kind of future. The future will come whether we will it or not, Kuruk interrupted gently. The war will continue until it ends. Your grief is yours to carry for as long as you need. But this moment, this is ours. And I am tired of denying what my heart tells me is true. And what does your heart tell you? His answer was to close the distance between them, to capture her lips in a kiss that stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her knees. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce and claiming and desperate, carrying all the pent-up longing of their snow-locked days. Sarah gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting in his hair, pulling him closer as heat exploded through her veins. This was nothing like kissing Thomas. Thomas had been gentle, careful, respectful. This was wild and raw and utterly consuming. This was a forest fire, a flash flood, a force of nature that swept away everything in its path. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kuruk rested his forehead against hers again. My heart tells me, he said roughly, that I have waited my entire life to find someone who sees me as more than a weapon, someone who looked at me dying in the snow and chose mercy over fear, someone who makes stillness feel like home. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. I'm afraid, she admitted. I'm so afraid of losing someone again, of letting myself feel this and having it ripped away. Then we will be afraid together. His hands cradled her face like she was something infinitely precious. But we will not let fear rob us of this, not when the winter has given us this gift of time. Sarah knew she should resist, should protect herself, should remember all the reasons this was impossible, forbidden, dangerous beyond measure. But as Kuruk's lips found hers again, as his arms wrapped around her and pulled her close, as the storm howled outside and the fire crackled inside, she felt something in her chest unfurl like spring flowers pushing through snow. She felt alive, truly, deeply, terrifyingly alive, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the possibility of joy. They made love that night by the fire, slow and reverent, learning each other's bodies like sacred texts. Kuruk was gentle despite his warrior's strength, his touches worshipful, his eyes never leaving hers as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Sarah let herself drown in sensation, in the heat of skin against skin, in the exquisite vulnerability of surrendering to desire. Afterward, wrapped in blankets and each other, Kuruk traced patterns on her shoulder, the same geometric designs he'd carved into the axe handle. What do they mean? Sarah asked sleepily. They are protection symbols, he murmured against her hair. For strength, for safety, for a long and prosperous life. You put them on my axe. Yes, because you want to protect me, because I cannot imagine a world where you are not safe and whole. He pressed a kiss to her temple. You have become necessary to me, Sarah Brennan. Like air, like water, like the sun rising in the east. Sarah turned in his arms, studying his face in the firelight. When the snow melts, we will face what comes, Kuruk said firmly. Together, if you will have me. It should have been impossible. It should have been mad. But as Sarah looked into the eyes of the Apache war chief who'd stumbled into her life on winter's darkest night, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will have you. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then we will make a life that defies all their rules. A life built on our own terms. Both worlds will hate us for it. Let them. Kuruk's arms tightened around her. We will create a third world. Ours. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The wind's howl softened to a whisper. And inside the small cabin, wrapped in firelight and each other's arms, two people who should have been enemies found something better than peace. They found home. The snow began to melt 3 weeks after Kuruk had first opened his eyes in Sarah's cabin. It started slowly, a drip here, a patch of brown earth there. But soon the world was alive with the sound of running water, of ice cracking, of winter reluctantly surrendering its grip on the land. Sarah stood at the doorway watching the transformation, Kuruk's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. The familiarity of the gesture still amazed her. How quickly they'd fallen into this intimacy, how natural it felt to exist in each other's space. "The passes will be clear within days," Kuruk murmured against her ear. "My people will be wondering what became of me." Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it approaching like distant thunder. But knowing and facing were two different things. "What will you tell them?" "The truth." His arms tightened around her. "That I was caught in the blizzard, that a brave woman saved my life, that I am returning to them, but not alone." She turned in his embrace, searching his face. "Kuruk, are you certain? Bringing a white woman into your camp, it could cause problems, resentment, anger. There will be those who question," he admitted. "But I am war chief. My word carries weight. And when they see what I see, your strength, your courage, your good heart, they will understand. And if they don't," his jaw set with determination, "then they will learn. You are mine now, Sarah, under my protection. That makes you untouchable." Despite her fears, warmth bloomed in her chest. "Yours," she repeated softly, testing the word. It should have chafed, should have reminded her of her uncle's attempts to sell her off like cattle. But coming from Kuruk, it felt different. It felt like belonging, like partnership, like home. "And I am yours," he said, reading the question in her eyes. "This claiming goes both ways. In my culture, marriage is a partnership of equals. The woman chooses her husband as much as he chooses her. And you, Sarah Brennan, have claimed my heart, as surely as I have claimed yours. Marriage." The word hung between them, enormous and terrifying and thrilling. Sarah had been married before, had stood in a small chapel and pledged herself to Thomas with hope shining in her heart. This felt different, bigger, like standing at the edge of a vast unknown and choosing to leap anyway. "I don't know your customs," she said quietly. "I don't know your language, your traditions. What if I fail? What if I can't?" Kuruk silenced her with a kiss, slow and deep and reassuring. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce with conviction. "You will learn, and my people will teach you with patience and respect, because you saved their chief, because you are brave enough to walk between two worlds, because you choose to stand beside me even when easier paths exist." "There are no easy paths," Sarah said with a shaky laugh, "only difficult ones in different directions. Then we walk the difficult path together." He took her hand, pressing it over his heart. "Feel this. Feel how it beats for you. This is real, Sarah. More real than any war, any border, any law made by men who never learned to see beyond their own fear." She felt it, the strong, steady rhythm beneath her palm, felt her own heart answering, beating in synchrony. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow. I need to return to my people, to ensure all is well. And I need to—" He hesitated, his expression growing serious. "There are rituals, ceremonies, ways of making our union official in the eyes of my people. It will take time, preparation." "How much time?" "A week, perhaps 2. We must speak with the elders, present gifts, perform the traditional rites." Kuruk's thumb stroked over her knuckles. "And during that time you will stay in my dwelling, under my protection. No one will harm you or show you disrespect." Sarah nodded slowly, trying to imagine it. Leaving this cabin, the last piece of Thomas she had left, to venture into Apache territory, to live among people who had every reason to hate her kind, to build a life with a man she'd known for less than a month, but who somehow felt essential as breathing. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good." Kuruk's smile was soft. "So am I. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite it." They spent that last day in the cabin preparing. Kuruk used materials from Sarah's small supply of cloth to fashion her more appropriate clothing. A simple dress in the style of Apache women, decorated with some of the beads from his own clothing. His hands were deft and sure as he sewed, and Sarah watched in fascination. "You're full of surprises," she said. "Among my people, men learn many skills: sewing, cooking, childcare. These are not women's tasks, they are human tasks, survival tasks. Very different from white society," Sarah mused, "where men consider such things beneath them." Then white men are fools who cripple themselves with false pride. Kuruk held up the dress, examining his work with a critical eye. This will do until we can have proper clothing made for you. That evening they sat together by the fire one last time. Sarah wrapped in Kuruk's arms, both of them quiet with the weight of transition. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, they would step out of this cocoon of isolation and face a world that would judge them harshly. "Tell me about your people," Sarah said softly. "I want to understand." So Kuruk spoke, of the Jicarilla way of life, of moving with the seasons, of the importance of family and clan. He described their dwelling places, their traditions, their beliefs about the sacred nature of all living things. His voice was warm with pride as he talked about his mother, who'd raised him alone after his father's death, about his younger sister, who'd married into another band, about the children who followed him around camp, eager to hear stories of his exploits. "You love them," Sarah observed. "They are my responsibility," Kuruk said simply. "Every decision I make, every battle I fight, it is for them, to keep them safe, to ensure they have a future. And now I'm part of that future. Now you are the heart of it." He turned her in his arms, his expression solemn. "I need you to understand something, Sarah. My life is not an easy one. As war chief, I am always in danger. There will be raids, battles, times when I must leave you to protect our people. Can you accept that?" Sarah thought of the months she'd spent alone after Thomas's death, of the grinding loneliness and fear. She thought of what Kuruk was offering, a life of purpose, of community, of love that burned bright even in the face of darkness. "I didn't survive this winter alone just to lose my courage now," she said firmly. "Yes, I can accept it, because the alternative, living without you, is unbearable." His kiss was answer enough. They left at dawn, Sarah carrying a pack with her few precious possessions, Thomas's books, her mother's locket, the wedding ring she couldn't quite bring herself to leave behind. Kuruk had fashioned a travois from branches and leather, loading it with supplies. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration. The journey took most of the day, winding through melting snow and emerging spring growth. Kuruk pointed out landmarks, teaching her the paths and signs that would help her navigate. He showed her which plants were safe to eat, where to find water, how to read the tracks of animals. Sarah absorbed it all like a sponge, recognizing this for what it was, preparation. He was teaching her how to survive in this world, giving her the tools she'd need to thrive. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they crested a ridge and Sarah's breath caught. Below them, nestled in a valley where the snow had already retreated, was the Apache camp. Dozens of dome-shaped dwellings arranged in loose clusters, smoke rising from cooking fires, people moving about in the complex dance of community life. "Home," Kuruk said softly, and Sarah heard the longing in his voice. They'd barely started down the slope when a shout went up. People began running toward them. Women, children, warriors. Sarah's grip tightened on Kuruk's hand, fear spiking through her, but he squeezed reassuringly. "They celebrate my return," he murmured. "Stand tall, show no fear. You are with me, and that means you are safe." The crowd surrounded them, speaking rapidly in a language Sarah didn't understand. She caught glimpses of curious faces, ranging from welcoming to wary to openly hostile. But Kuruk's presence seemed to command respect. People made way for him, though their eyes kept darting to Sarah with undisguised curiosity. An older woman pushed through the crowd, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and bright. She spoke rapidly to Kuruk, gesturing expressively, her tone clearly scolding. He responded calmly, then gestured to Sarah. The woman's gaze fixed on her, and Sarah felt herself being evaluated with a thoroughness that would have done her Boston finishing school teachers proud. Then, to her surprise, the woman smiled, a genuine warmth that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She said something in Apache, then reached out and touched Sarah's cheek gently. Kuruk translated, "My mother says you have the look of someone who has known sorrow. She welcomes you to our people and thanks you for bringing her son home." Sarah's throat tightened. Tell her I am honored to be here." Kuruk translated, and his mother nodded approvingly. She spoke again, longer this time, and Kuruk's expression grew both pleased and slightly embarrassed. "What did she say?" Sarah asked. "She says I have chosen well. that you have strong eyes and a brave heart, and that she looks forward to teaching you all the things I am too foolish to know." His lips twitched. "She is not subtle." Despite her nervousness, Sarah laughed. The sound seemed to ease something in the gathered crowd. A few people smiled. A child darted forward, touching Sarah's red hair with gentle curiosity before scampering back to his mother. Kuruk's mother took charge then, shooing away the crowd with authoritative gestures. She linked her arm through Sarah's with surprising strength, clearly claiming her as a project. Kuruk fell into step beside them as they walked through the camp, his mother chattering away in Apache, while occasionally pointing at various landmarks. They stopped at a dwelling larger than the others. Kuruk's mother gestured for them to enter, and Sarah ducked through the low doorway into a space that was surprisingly spacious and comfortable. Woven mats covered the floor, and carefully organized supplies lined the walls. A fire pit sat in the center, the smoke hole above letting in the late afternoon light. "This is my home," Kuruk said quietly, "and now it is yours as well." Sarah looked around, trying to imagine herself living here, belonging here. It was so different from her cabin, from the Boston townhouse where she'd grown up. But as Kuruk's mother bustled about preparing tea, as Kuruk stood close beside her with his hand warm on her back, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Not quite belonging. Not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning. Over the following days, Sarah was introduced to the complex rhythms of Apache life. Kuruk's mother, whose name was Desba, meaning going to war, took her under her wing with fierce determination. Despite the language barrier, they communicated through gestures, demonstrations, and an impressive amount of patience on Desba's part. Sarah learned to prepare food the Apache way, to tan hides, to make the flatbread that was a staple of their diet. She learned which plants had medicinal properties, how to preserve meat for travel, how to weave baskets from willow branches. The work was hard, her hands blistered and aching, but there was a satisfaction in it she hadn't expected. She was learning, growing, becoming part of something larger than herself. Not everyone was welcoming. Some of the warriors looked at her with suspicion or outright hostility. She heard the word "white eyes" muttered more than once, felt the weight of their judgment. But Kuruk's presence was a shield. When he was near, no one dared show her open disrespect. He was magnificent among his people, commanding without being tyrannical, listening more than he spoke, making decisions with careful consideration. Sarah watched him settle disputes, plan hunting parties, sit in council with the elders, and felt her respect for him deepen. This was a man who carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders, who'd been shaped by war, but hadn't let it destroy his capacity for tenderness. At night, they lay together in his dwelling, and he taught her words in his language. Simple things at first. Water, fire, food, sky, then more complex. Love, home, forever. She taught him poetry, reading from her precious books by the firelight, trying to share the beauty of words she'd always treasured. "Your language is strange," Kuruk observed one evening, his head pillowed on her lap as she ran her fingers through his hair. "So many words for the same thing, so much complexity." "Your language is beautiful," Sarah countered. "Every word feels purposeful, nothing wasted." "Like your people versus my people," he mused. "Whites use many words but often say little. Apaches use few words but make them count. Is that why you're so quiet sometimes?" He smiled, his eyes closed, clearly relaxed. "I am quiet because I am learning to speak the language of peace instead of war. You make me want to use soft words, gentle words, words that build instead of destroy." Sarah bent to kiss his forehead. "You're already doing that. Every day." A week into her stay, the elders called a formal council. Kuruk explained that they needed to discuss the marriage ceremony to ensure all traditions were properly observed. Sarah dressed carefully in the clothing Desba had helped her make, a long tunic and leggings decorated with intricate beadwork, her hair braided in the Apache style. The council was intimidating, a circle of weathered faces, men and women both, who regarded her with varying degrees of acceptance and skepticism. But Kuruk stood beside her, his presence steady and sure, and Sarah drew strength from him. The eldest of the council, a woman named Kai, who must have been at least 80, spoke first. Kuruk translated quietly, his voice low beside Sarah's ear. "She asks why you wish to join our people. What you seek here that you could not find in your own world. Sarah took a deep breath, then spoke clearly, trusting Kuruk to translate accurately. I seek freedom, the freedom to choose my own path, to make my own decisions. In my world, women are property. We are traded and sold, our wishes ignored, our voices silenced. Kuruk has shown me that another way is possible. He has offered me partnership, not ownership, respect, not domination. I wish to join your people because I believe in those values, because I have seen the strength of your women, the honor of your warriors. Because Kuruk saved my soul as surely as I saved his life. Kuruk translated, and Sarah watched the council members' faces. Some looked skeptical, others thoughtful. Kai's expression was unreadable. Another elder spoke, a man with scars crossing his face and wisdom in his eyes. Kuruk translated, Nashoba asks what you will do when your people come with guns and soldiers. When they demand you return or threaten war, will you stand with us, or will you choose your own kind? The question struck at Sarah's deepest fears, but she answered without hesitation. I have already chosen. I chose when I pulled Kuruk from the snow. I chose when I left my cabin to come here. I choose every morning when I wake beside him. My people abandoned me long before I left them. This, she gestured to encompass the camp, the people, Kuruk beside her. This is my kind now. Kuruk's hand found hers, squeezing gently. His translation carried the weight of her conviction, and Sarah saw several council members nod approvingly. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, probing, testing, evaluating. They asked about her skills, her willingness to learn, her understanding of what she was choosing. Through it all, Sarah answered honestly, holding nothing back. Finally, Kai raised her hand for silence. She spoke at length, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience. When she finished, Kuruk's shoulders relaxed in visible relief. She says the council accepts you, he translated, his voice thick with emotion. They recognize that you come to us not as a conqueror or a spy, but as someone seeking a true home. They will perform the marriage ceremony at the next full moon, 3 days from now. Until then, you are to be instructed in our ways by the women of the tribe, so you understand fully what you are choosing. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, she said, looking around the circle. I will honor your trust. I swear it. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind. The women of the tribe descended on Sarah with determined energy, teaching her everything she needed to know. They showed her the sacred rituals, explained the meanings behind various ceremonies, instructed her in the duties and rights of an Apache wife. To her surprise, many were warm and welcoming. They shared stories, laughed at her mistakes with good humor, and patiently corrected her pronunciation. Desba was a constant presence, her pride in Sarah's progress evident in every smile and nod. But the most important lessons came from a woman named Halona, who was married to one of Kuruk's warriors. She spoke some English, learned from a captured settler years ago, and she became Sarah's interpreter and guide. You must understand, Halona said one afternoon as they worked together preparing herbs, that marrying a war chief is not easy. He belongs to all the people, not just to you. There will be times when duty calls him away, times when he must make choices that cause him pain. Can you bear this? Sarah thought of Thomas, of the quiet life they'd built together. This would be different, louder, more public, more demanding, but also richer, fuller, a life with purpose beyond mere survival. I can bear anything, she said firmly, as long as I don't have to bear it alone. Halona smiled. Then you will do well here. We are not solitary people. We share burdens, share joys. You will never be alone again, Sarah. Sometimes you will wish for more solitude. She laughed. But you will always have family. The night before the ceremony, Desba brought Sarah to a sweat lodge where several older women waited. Through gesture and Halona's translation, they explained this was a purification ritual, a way of preparing for the transition from one life to another. The heat was intense, almost unbearable. Sarah felt sweat pour from her skin, felt her head grow light and strange. The women chanted in their language, their voices rising and falling like waves. And somewhere in that heat-drenched darkness, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years, of Thomas, buried in the cold ground, of her uncle, and the life he'd tried to force upon her, of the girl she'd been in Boston. Frightened, defiant, desperate for escape. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd survived winter alone, who'd saved a dying warrior, who'd chosen love over fear. A woman who was about to pledge herself to a man, and a people who represented everything her old world had taught her to hate. And she felt no regrets, only a fierce, bright certainty that this was right. When they emerged from the sweat lodge, the moon was high and full, painting the world in silver. Desba took Sarah's hand, squeezing gently. She spoke in Apache, and though Sarah didn't understand all the words, she caught the most important one. Daughter. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, mixing with the sweat still cooling on her skin. She squeezed back, unable to find words in any language adequate to express what she felt. The ceremony began at dawn. Sarah stood before the assembled tribe wearing a dress of soft white doeskin, decorated with hundreds of intricate beads that Desba and the other women had sewn. Her hair hung loose down her back, as was traditional for Apache brides, with a single eagle feather woven into it, a gift from Kuruk representing freedom and strength. Kuruk stood across from her, magnificent in his ceremonial clothing. His chest was bare, painted with symbols Sarah had learned represented protection and prosperity. His eyes never left hers, dark and intense, and filled with a love so clear it made her breath catch. The ceremony was conducted by Kai, the eldest. She spoke in Apache, her words carrying across the gathered crowd. Halona stood beside Sarah, translating in whispers. "She speaks of the sacred bond between man and woman," Halona murmured, "of how marriage is not ownership, but partnership, how both must be strong for the union to prosper, how love is a choice made new each day, not a chain that binds." Kai called Kuruk forward. He spoke then, his voice clear and strong, and though Sarah couldn't understand all the words, she heard her name. Heard the word for love, for forever, for home. Halona translated, "He says you are his heart made visible, that you walked into his life through snow and storm and changed everything, that he pledges his strength to your protection, his wisdom to your guidance, his love to your keeping, that he will honor your freedom even as he claims your heart, that you are his partner, his equal, his choice." Sarah's tears fell freely now. When Kai gestured for her to speak, she took a shaky breath and began, Halona translating her English into Apache for the crowd. "I came to these mountains seeking freedom and found loneliness instead. I thought I wanted to be alone, to need no one. But Kuruk taught me that true strength isn't isolation. It's choosing to stand beside someone even when the world says you shouldn't. He taught me that love isn't a cage, but a home. I pledge my heart to his keeping, my strength to our partnership, my life to building something beautiful in this wild place. I choose him. I choose this. I choose us." Kai nodded approvingly. She produced 2 cords, one white, one brown, and bound Kuruk and Sarah's hands together, speaking words that Halona said represented the joining of 2 lives, 2 peoples, 2 destinies. "You are now one," Kai pronounced, and the tribe erupted in celebration. The feast that followed was overwhelming. Food, music, dancing, laughter. People came to offer congratulations, to touch Sarah's hand, to welcome her officially into the tribe. Children darted between adults, playing games Sarah didn't understand, but found delightful nonetheless. Elders told stories, warriors demonstrated skills, and through it all, Kuruk stayed close, his hand never far from hers. As night fell and the celebration continued, he leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Are you happy?" Sarah turned to look at him. This man who'd stumbled into her life, frozen and dying, who'd become her lover, her partner, her husband. She thought of all she'd left behind, all she'd found, all that lay ahead. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I am." His smile was radiant. "Then I have everything I need." They slipped away from the celebration eventually, retreating to their dwelling where privacy awaited. The marriage bed had been prepared with soft furs and woven blankets, and as Kuruk gently removed Sarah's ceremonial dress, as his hands worshipped her body with reverent touches, as they came together in the ancient dance of love and desire, Sarah felt complete in a way she never had before. This was home. Not the cabin in the mountains, not the townhouse in Boston. This, Kuruk's arms, his people, this wild, beautiful land, this was where she belonged, "I love you," she whispered against his skin, the words in English but the feeling universal. "Ayor anoshni," he murmured back, and Halona had taught her what that meant. "I love you" in the language of his people, their people now, their family, their future. Spring turned to summer, and Sarah Brennan, now Sarah who walks between worlds as the tribe had named her, found herself settling into Apache life with surprising ease. The language came slowly but steadily, her tongue learning to wrap around the unfamiliar sounds. The customs became second nature, the ways of showing respect, of participating in communal decisions, of contributing to the tribe's survival. But the greatest surprise was how completely she'd been embraced. The initial skepticism had faded as she proved herself willing to learn, to work, to fully commit to her new people. She helped tan hides until her arms ached, gathered medicinal plants under the guidance of the tribe's healer, and even learned to ride the small, tough ponies the Apache favored. Kuruk watched her transformation with pride and something deeper, a contentment she'd never seen in him before. He was still the war chief, still carried the weight of leadership, but there was a softness to him now that hadn't existed before. In the privacy of their dwelling, he was simply her husband, the man who held her through the night and whispered poetry against her skin in 2 languages. The outside world, however, was not so peaceful. As summer deepened, tensions with nearby settlers escalated. Kuruk spent long hours in council meetings, strategizing how to protect their territory without triggering all-out war. Sarah attended when invited, learning to navigate the complex politics of survival in a land where 2 cultures clashed with increasing violence. One evening, Kuruk returned from a scouting mission looking troubled. Sarah was preparing their evening meal, had learned to make the cornmeal cakes he favored, and she looked up at his expression with immediate concern. "What happened?" He sank down beside the fire, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Soldiers are building a new fort, 50 miles south. They say it's for protection, but we know what it means. More patrols, more restrictions, more of our land taken." Sarah set aside the food and moved to sit behind him, her hands finding the knotted muscles of his shoulders and beginning to work at the tension there. "What will you do?" "What I always do. Try to find a path that keeps our people safe without surrendering our dignity." He leaned back into her touch with a sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if there's any path left at all. Every year they push further, take more, break every treaty as soon as the ink dries." "Then we adapt," Sarah said firmly, her hands still working. "We find ways to survive that they don't anticipate. We outthink them instead of just outfighting them." Kuruk turned to look at her, surprise and admiration in his eyes. "For you sound like a chief. I'm married to one. It rubs off." She smiled, then sobered. "But I'm serious, Kuruk. You're the best warrior I've ever known. But maybe that's not enough anymore. Maybe it's time to be clever, instead of just strong." Over the following weeks, they worked together on a strategy. Sarah's knowledge of white society, combined with Kuruk's intimate understanding of the land and his people's needs, allowed them to craft approaches that confused and frustrated the military commanders. They moved camp frequently, always staying just ahead of patrols. They established complex networks of communication that allowed them to avoid conflicts before they began. It wasn't perfect. There were still skirmishes, still close calls. But the large-scale violence that everyone had feared never materialized. The soldiers grew frustrated, the settlers confused, and the Apache people began to whisper that perhaps their war chief had found something more powerful than his fighting skills. He'd found wisdom. Sarah's role in the tribe evolved beyond what she'd imagined. The women sought her counsel on matters involving interactions with whites. Young people wanted to learn English from her, seeing the value in understanding the enemy's language. She became a bridge between worlds, using her unique position to foster understanding where possible and protect her people where necessary. But the greatest change came in autumn when Sarah realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't been sure until Desba, whose experience in such matters was vast, confirmed it with a knowing smile and a stream of excited Apache that Sarah's improving language skills allowed her to mostly understand. That evening, when Kuruk returned from a hunting expedition, Sarah met him at the edge of camp. He took one look at her face, and his expression shifted from tired to alert in an instant. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." Sarah took his hands, placing them on her still flat belly. "Everything is right, surprisingly. Wonderfully right. Understanding dawned slowly, and when it did, Kuruk's face transformed. The stern war chief disappeared, replaced by a man overcome with joy and wonder. He dropped to his knees right there in front of half the camp, pressing his forehead against her stomach, his hands trembling against her hips. "A child," he breathed. "We're going to have a child." "Yes." Sarah's fingers tangled in his hair, her own eyes wet with tears. "Yes, we are." The news spread through camp like wildfire. The celebration that followed rivaled their wedding feast. Desba wept openly, clutching Sarah to her chest and speaking rapid blessings. The other women surrounded her with advice and stories, already planning for the birth. Even the most skeptical warriors offered congratulations, seeing in Sarah's pregnancy a symbol of the tribe's future. That night, alone in their dwelling, Kuruk held Sarah with a tenderness that made her heart ache. His hand rested protectively over her womb, his eyes distant, with thoughts she couldn't quite read. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about what kind of world we're bringing this child into," he admitted. "A world at war. A world where their very existence will be controversial. Apache and white, belonging fully to neither world." "They'll belong to both," Sarah corrected gently. "And that will be their strength, not their weakness. They'll understand things neither of our peoples can alone. They'll be the bridge we've been trying to build." Kuruk's eyes found hers in the firelight. "You're not afraid?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also hopeful. Because this child, our child, represents something new, something neither side expected. Love that defies boundaries, a future that neither of our peoples dared imagine." He kissed her then, slow and deep and reverent. "You make me believe in that future," he murmured against her lips. "You make me believe in peace." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Sarah continued her work in the tribe, though the women wouldn't let her do anything too strenuous. Desba was a constant presence, sharing the wisdom of her own pregnancies, teaching Sarah the herbs and practices that would ease birth and ensure the baby's health. Winter came again, but this time Sarah faced it with a community around her, with Kuruk's arms to keep her warm, with the knowledge that new life grew within her. The contrast to the previous winter, alone, grieving, barely surviving, was so stark it sometimes made her dizzy. "Do you ever regret it?" Kuruk asked one snowy evening as they lay tangled together beneath thick furs. "Leaving your old life? Living here?" Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought of Boston's comforts, of the cabin where she'd loved Thomas, of all the paths not taken. But when she opened her mouth, the answer came easily. "Never. Not once." She turned to face him, her hand finding his where it rested on her swollen belly. "This life, with you, with our child, with your people, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. It's hard, yes, sometimes scary, but it's real in a way nothing else ever has been. It's mine in a way my old life never was. Even when warriors look at you with suspicion, even when you struggle with the language, even when winter storms trap us for days. Especially then," Sarah said firmly, "because those struggles mean something. They're not just about surviving. They're about building, creating, becoming someone I actually want to be." Kuruk pulled her closer, his nose buried in her hair. "I don't know what I did to deserve you walking into my life." "You almost froze to death outside my cabin," Sarah pointed out with a laugh. "Not exactly heroic, but effective." His hand spread wide over her belly, feeling their child move beneath his palm. "Very, very effective." The baby came with the spring thaw, arriving in the traditional way of Apache births. Sarah labored in a special dwelling with Desba and the other experienced mothers around her, their voices guiding her through each contraction, their hands supporting her as she worked to bring new life into the world. Kuruk paced outside, prevented by tradition from entering until the birth was complete. Sarah could hear him even through her pain, could picture him wearing a path in the earth, his worry palpable even from a distance. The birth was hard, hours of relentless pain that left Sarah exhausted and shaking. But when Desba finally placed a squalling infant in her arms, when Sarah looked down at the tiny face with its shock of dark hair, and skin that was neither fully white nor fully Apache, but beautifully in between, every moment of pain vanished in a wave of overwhelming love. "Son," Desba announced, her face radiant with pride. "Strong and healthy, With his father's eyes and his mother's fire, someone went to fetch Kuruk, and moments later he burst through the doorway, all protocols forgotten in his desperate need to see his family. He stopped short at the sight of Sarah cradling their son, his expression transforming into something so tender it made every woman in the dwelling smile. "Come meet your son," Sarah said softly, her own voice thick with tears. Kuruk approached like he was walking on sacred ground. When he finally took the baby in his large calloused hands, when his son wrapped tiny fingers around one of his, the fierce war chief wept openly and without shame. "He's perfect," Kuruk breathed. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Takoda, friend to everyone, because he represented the hope of peace between peoples. Kuruk added a second name in English, Thomas, after the man whose death had set Sarah on the path that led to this moment. It felt right, honoring the past while celebrating the future. The tribe welcomed Takoda with elaborate ceremonies and abundant gifts. He was showered with blessings from the elders, protected by prayers from the spiritual leaders, celebrated as a symbol of continuity and hope. Even those who'd been skeptical of Sarah's place among them melted at the sight of the infant who carried both worlds in his blood. As spring turned to summer, and Takoda grew from helpless newborn to alert infant, Sarah and Kuruk settled into the rhythms of parenthood. Nights were exhausting, punctuated by feeding and diaper changes, and the mysteries of why an infant who'd slept peacefully all day would suddenly decide that 3 a.m. was the perfect time to be awake and demanding attention. But the days were magical. Sarah watched Kuruk transform into a devoted father, carrying Takoda everywhere in a cradleboard, talking to him constantly in both Apache and English, singing songs that made their son's eyes go wide with wonder. He was gentle and patient in ways that seemed at odds with his reputation as a fearsome warrior, but Sarah understood that this was the same man, one who protected fiercely what he loved. Desba was an endless source of support, teaching Sarah the traditional ways of caring for infants, sharing the wisdom passed down through generations. The other women of the tribe rallied around them, creating a network of support that meant Sarah was never truly alone with the challenges of new motherhood. One evening, when Takoda was 6 months old and beginning to babble in sounds that belonged to no particular language, Sarah sat outside their dwelling, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Kuruk emerged with their son in his arms, settling beside her with the easy comfort of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how much has changed," Sarah said softly. 2 years ago, I was alone in a cabin, convinced I'd never be happy again. Now look at us, a family, a community, a life I couldn't have imagined if I tried." Kuruk shifted Takoda to one arm so he could pull Sarah close with the other. "Do you remember that first night, when you told me you didn't come to the West to be anyone's property? I remember thinking you were probably going to kill me," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met." His lips brushed her temple. "And that I would do anything to keep that fire in your eyes burning. You succeeded." Sarah leaned into him, watching Takoda grab at his father's finger with determined little hands. "This life isn't what I planned. It's better." As summer deepened, the tribe's relationship with nearby settlers began to shift. Word had spread about Kuruk's white wife, about their son who belonged to both worlds. Some settlers remained hostile, but others, seeing that coexistence was possible, began reaching out tentatively. Small trades, careful conversations, the beginnings of understanding. Sarah found herself increasingly serving as translator and mediator. Her presence reassured the settlers that the Apache weren't mindless savages, while her obvious happiness and integration into the tribe challenged their assumptions. It was delicate work, requiring patience and diplomacy, but slowly, so slowly, progress was made. There were still incidents, still violence, still grief and loss on both sides. But there were also moments of hope. A settler woman who came to Desba for help with a difficult birth, an Apache warrior who shared hunting knowledge with a struggling homesteader. Small gestures that suggested a different future might be possible. Kuruk watched these developments with cautious optimism. He'd spent so many years fighting, so many years seeing his people suffer, that hope felt dangerous. But with Sarah beside him and Takoda in his arms, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Their son would grow up in a world where the color of his skin mattered less than the content of his character. One night, as autumn painted the world in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah woke to find Kuruk standing by the doorway, Takoda sleeping peacefully in his arms, staring out at the starlit landscape. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "I was thinking about my father," Kuruk said, his voice distant. "He died when I was young, killed in a raid. I used to wonder what kind of man I'd become, what he'd think of my choices." Sarah rose and moved to stand beside him, looking up at his profile in the darkness. "And? I think he'd be proud." Kuruk's eyes dropped to his son's sleeping face. "Not of the battles I've won or the enemies I've defeated, but of this, of choosing love over hate, of building instead of only destroying, of being brave enough to let someone like you change everything." "It was mutual," Sarah reminded him gently. "You changed me too. We changed each other." His free arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close. "And now we'll change the world for him, make it better, safer, more accepting." "It's a big job," Sarah observed. "Good thing we have help." Kuruk gestured with his chin toward the rest of the sleeping camp, toward all the people who'd become Sarah's family. "We're not alone in this." The years that followed weren't easy. There were still conflicts, still challenges, still moments when the fragile peace they'd helped build seemed ready to shatter. But through it all, Sarah and Kuruk stood together, raising Takoda, and eventually his younger sister Nasha, meaning owl, in a home filled with love and laughter and 2 languages. They taught their children to honor both their heritages, to see strength in their mixed blood rather than shame. They built bridges between communities, proving through their very existence that love could transcend boundaries that war had made seem insurmountable. Sarah never forgot her old life, still kept Thomas's books, still sometimes dreamed of Boston's cobblestone streets. But when she woke, it was to Kuruk's arms and the sound of their children's laughter, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that this was where she belonged. She'd come to the mountains seeking freedom and found something better: purpose, family, love that burned bright enough to melt winter's deepest cold. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the camp was peaceful, she and Kuruk would sit together watching the stars, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, hearts beating in rhythm. "Are you happy?" he would ask, the same question he'd posed on their wedding day. And Sarah's answer never changed. Yes, always yes, because she'd learned that happiness wasn't found in grand destinations or perfect circumstances. It was found in choosing to stand beside someone even when the world said you shouldn't, in building a life one small decision at a time, in loving fiercely and without reservation, regardless of the cost. She'd saved an Apache warrior from freezing in the snow, not knowing he would claim her heart. But the truth was deeper and more beautiful than that. They'd saved each other. From loneliness. From despair. From lives half-lived in the shadows of fear. Together they'd built something new, something neither of their peoples had imagined possible, a family that bridged 2 worlds, a love that defied every rule. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. The end. Dear listener, you know what strikes me most about Sarah and Kuruk's story? It's not the romance. It's not the triumph. It's something far simpler and deeper. They were both completely broken when they found each other. Kuruk was literally dying. Sarah was emotionally frozen, merely existing, not living. Neither was their best self. Neither was ready or healed or complete. And yet they chose to save each other anyway. This makes me think of you, perhaps listening to this story late at night, when the house is too quiet and your thoughts become too loud. Maybe you're feeling like that man freezing in the snow, invisible, forgotten, waiting for someone to notice you're still here. Or perhaps you're like Sarah, still functioning, still surviving, but with a heart so numb from loneliness's cold that you can't even remember what real warmth feels like. Here's what nobody tells you. You don't need to be okay to deserve connection. Our culture teaches us this cruel lie that we need to be healed before we deserve love, that we need to work on ourselves before allowing anyone close, that our worth is conditional on our ability to be whole, functional, without baggage. But look at Sarah and Kuruk. They saved each other precisely because they were broken. Sarah understood Kuruk's cold because she knew her own internal winter. Kuruk recognized Sarah's loneliness because he carried his own. It wasn't their perfection that created love. It was the honest vulnerability of two people who stopped pretending to be fine. So if tonight you're tired of being strong, that's okay. If you're exhausted from smiling when all you want to do is cry, that's human. If you look around and wonder whether there's still a place for you in this world that seems to have moved on without you, hear this. There is. You are not the weight you carry. You are not the mistakes you've made. You are not the opportunities you missed or the years that have passed. You are that shy spark that still refuses to be completely extinguished, the same one that made Sarah drag a stranger through the snow when closing the door would have been easier. The same one that made Kuruk open his eyes and choose to fight for life one more day. That spark. It's enough. It always has been. Today when you woke up, you may not have saved an Apache warrior, but maybe you fed a bird at your window. Maybe you smiled at someone at the store. Maybe you simply took a deep breath and decided to continue, even when every fiber of your being wanted to give up. That is heroism. That is courage. That is worthy of an epic story. Great narratives aren't about perfect people doing extraordinary things. They're about ordinary people, often broken, choosing kindness when bitterness would be easier, choosing connection when isolation would be safer. Tonight, I want you to know something that perhaps no one has told you in a long time. You're doing better than you think. The days you survived, those impossible days where simply getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable mountain, you conquered them. You're here, still feeling, still capable of being moved by the story of two people who found warmth in the middle of the cold. That means your heart still works, still beats, can still love. It doesn't matter how many winters you've crossed. It doesn't matter how many times you've been left freezing in life's metaphorical snow. You're still here. And as long as you're here, as long as there's that stubborn spark of life within you, there is hope. Not the silly hope of fairy tale endings, but the raw, real hope that tomorrow might be 1 degree less cold than today. That next week, maybe you'll find your own small reason to genuinely smile. That at some point, doesn't have to be now, doesn't have to be soon, you might find your own kind of warmth. It could be a person, it could be a purpose, it could be a cat that shows up on your porch, it could be the way sunlight comes through the window on Tuesday mornings. It doesn't need to be grand, it just needs to be real. So sleep, dear listener, not with the burden of having to be strong tomorrow, not with the pressure of having to be healed or ready or better. Sleep knowing you are exactly enough, exactly as you are in this exact moment. Your story is still being written. And sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin in the most unlikely moments, when you're freezing in the snow, when you're alone in the cabin, when you think there's nothing left. That's precisely where magic tends to appear. Good night. Breathe deeply. You've made it this far, and that's already extraordinary. With deep respect for your journey. The Wild West Whispers team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please leave us a comment. We love hearing your thoughts and feelings. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel. Your support, truly from the bottom of our hearts, helps us stay inspired to keep telling stories full of love, redemption, and life-changing surprises. At the end of this video, another one of our moving stories will appear. Click and let yourself be surprised by yet another unforgettable journey. Thank you for being here. Wild West Whispers team.